So I like to think of synthesis as a signal flow. And the reason I like to think of it as a signal flow is because if we understand the process of how when a waveform is generated in the oscillators and it travels through the envelopes, the filters and out through the amp, we can translate that to whatever keyboard we're using or software synth and it will work the same. The layout may be different to whatever keyboard you're using or software synth, but if we understand the principle of how sound is generated and how we can manipulate that and turn it into whatever we want, you can translate that to whatever you're using. So let's start here with the oscillator section. Just ignore this envelope bit for now, we'll get to that. Oscillators generate waveforms. So on this Roland Gaia, let's flick through the different waveforms we have on here to hear what they sound like. So we have the saw wave, we have a square, we have the pulse. On the Roland Gaia we have a section here dedicated to the pulse width, so we can change the width of that pulse and we can also modulate that width, which can become very useful later on when we're trying to add movement to our sound. We have the triangle wave, we have the sine wave, noise and super saw. So many different keyboards will have different waveforms, and the beauty of these different waveforms is they give us different characteristics, and those characteristics help us make different sounds. So on the Roland Gaia we only have a limited number of waveforms, but we have 3 variations of that sound. We also have ring mod and sync mod. Moving to the filter section for now. We have a cutoff and we have resonance. Now the filter helps us shape our sound tonally now. So at the minute we have the low pass filter selected. As I bring down the cutoff, we're filtering out some of the high information. If we flick through the different filter types, the high pass filter is filtering out some of the low information. The band pass is giving us a dip in the frequency spectrum as we sweep through it with the cutoff. And the peaking is going to give us an opposite thing, which is going to give us a boost in the frequency spectrum as we sweep through the filter. And we have bypass. We also have a 12 dB and 24 dB slope cutoff. Two. The amp section just gives us overall control over the whole volume. Now as we move to the envelope section, each envelope is dedicated to its specific section, so it's already pre-assigned. On some software you can assign whatever you want the envelope to go to. On this one, they're already pre-assigned. Now before I start, let me just explain the 4 main stages of the envelopes. Now these may be different on different keyboards, they may have more, they may have less, but the 4 main stages to help us understand what an envelope does are the attack, decay, sustain and the release. Now I like to think of an envelope as a gate. And the reason I like to think of it as a gate is because I think, well, as soon as I approach the gate, how fast I want it to open. This is my attack. Once it's opened, how fast I want it to slowly come down to where I want it to stop. My decay. Where do I want it to stop for until I want it to close, which is my sustain. And once I've finished and I've gone through the gate, how fast I want it to close. That's my release. Now on this keyboard, we have envelope depth, so we can control how much of that envelope actually controls our overall sound. So we can have it all the way, we can have it part of the way, or we can have it none. We can also have it minus, is also doing the opposite. On the amp section, we don't have that control. It will control only the whole entire range. So let's start with the envelope in the oscillator section. As we increase the depth and I increase the decay, as we increase the time of the decay, the time it takes the pitch to dip back to 0 is determined by how much of the decay I use. And by controlling the depth, I can control how much of that is affected. Now this can become interesting later on when we get into making basses and any sort of glissando effects. This will be very useful. The envelope for the filter section now, as I increase the depth here and I bring the cutoff to about halfway, you'll notice that nothing's changed. As I increase the attack, you can hear how the envelope now begins to shape. So it's giving us this sort of effect, which is the time it takes for the filter to open up and reach the decay and sustain point. So my attack is how long it takes for the filter to open up. Once I've hit the decay stage, it's how fast does it reach my sustain level. And what you'll find interesting here is my sustain is now my cutoff point. Where do I want my gate to stay open? Dip, and sustain, release, straight off. That same principle with the amp now. Now having an envelope on the amp section is going to be useful when we want to start making pads. When we want our sound to kind of fade in. We don't want it instant. And we want some longer release. Now let's get into the world of modulation. This opens the door to create interesting movement in our sounds. The LFO, also known as the low frequency oscillator, generates a rhythmic pulse. The shape of the pulse is determined by the waveform generated by the LFO. The interesting thing about modulation is we can choose where or what we want to modulate. Now on this keyboard, the modulation destinations are already pre-assigned. So I have a pitch, I have one for the filter, and I have one for the amp. These are our different waveforms which shape the pulse of the LFO. We also have a fade time for how fast do we want this LFO modulation effect to take place. So right now it will be instant. With the fade time, it will give it a slight delay. Now let's talk about effects. Now effects gives us another palette to kind of color our sound and make it more interesting. So your keyboard may have different effects, some have got more, or if you're using software stuff, you can use third-party plugins. But on here, we have, I like to use Bit Crush, we've got some fuzz, we have some distortion. We've also got pitch shift, which is really interesting. On this keyboard, as we don't have a unison option, the pitch shift gives that sort of chorusy effect. And if I use some panning delay, but make the delay quite quick, I can get an almost slapback delay effect. And then we have some reverb. So now that I've covered the basics, you can experiment in your own time, getting used to how the different waveforms sound, messing with the envelopes, the filter, the amp, playing with some LFO modulation and effects, creating your own sound. So later on when we come to make some of the patches and presets for our sample pack, you're more familiar with synthesis.